Salvatore Sal Caruso was only 37 years old, but he already controlled half of Boston's underworld from behind the polished facade of Caruso Holdings, a multi-million-dollar real estate empire that stretched from Back Bay to the dockyards of South Boston. He wore three-piece suits tailored in Milan, drove a black Rolls-Royce with tinted windows, and spoke in a voice so low and calm that grown men trembled when he whispered. Because in Sal's world, when he lowered his voice, someone was about to lose something they'd never get back. His fiancée, Bianca Whitfield, was a 31-year-old former model who knew exactly how to smile for the cameras and cry on cue, the kind of woman who looked like devotion in a designer dress but calculated every kiss like a business transaction. On the night that changed everything, Sal was riding home from a secret meeting where he'd just closed the biggest deal of his career. Rain hammering the windshield, city lights bleeding through the glass, his phone buzzing with Bianca's name, but he didn't answer because he wanted to tell her in person. He wanted to see her face light up the way it used to, not knowing those would be the last sounds he'd ever hear for a very long time. The SUV came out of nowhere at a dead intersection. No plates, no warning, just blinding headlights, and then the sickening crunch of metal folding like paper, and the world went black. 4 days later, Sal woke up in a hospital bed with a shattered arm, cracked ribs, and a silence so absolute it felt like being buried alive, because the doctors told him, scribbling on a whiteboard since he couldn't hear a single word, that the trauma had destroyed his inner ear and the chances of recovery were almost non-existent. But here's where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. Not Bianca, not Franco De Luca, the ambitious traitor who'd been waiting for Sal to fall, and certainly not Josephine Josie Reyes, a 27-year-old single mother from Dorchester who'd been scrubbing hotel floors and washing dishes just to keep her 2-year-old son, Tommy, fed, and her dying mother in a nursing home she couldn't afford. Josie walked into Sal's mansion carrying a torn duffel bag and a baby on her hip, and she had no idea she'd just stepped into the most dangerous household in Massachusetts. But she also had no idea that her quiet kindness, her handwritten notes, her son's tiny hand on a mafia boss's scarred cheek, and a lullaby she sang every night thinking no one could hear, would become the only sounds that pulled the most feared man in Boston back from the edge of darkness and showed him what it truly means to be loved when you have nothing left to offer. If this story already has your heart racing, smash that like button so more people can find it, share it with someone who believes real love still exists, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single chapter of what happens next. Now let's get back to today's story and find out exactly how a lullaby in the dark brought the most dangerous man in Boston to his knees. The fluorescent lights in the VIP hospital room at Massachusetts General Hospital flickered like the pulse of a heart about to stop, and Salvatore Caruso lay there amid IV lines and the beeping of a monitor he could no longer hear, his left arm in a cast suspended on a support, 3 cracked ribs on his right side, turning every breath into a knife slicing through him, a stitched wound nearly 10 centimeters long on his forehead, still seeping blood through the white bandage. Yet all that physical pain was nothing compared to the sensation of sinking into a bottomless well with no sound to cling to. Bianca sat on the chair beside the bed, her eyes swollen and red, her lips moving non-stop as if whispering words of comfort. But Sal only saw her mouth moving like a silent film without subtitles, and something about the way she cried felt strange to him, the tears falling on cue, the shoulders shaking at just the right rhythm, the hand resting on his chest in exactly the right place, as if she had rehearsed this scene in front of a mirror many times. But Sal pushed the thought away because he didn't want to doubt the only woman still sitting beside him at this moment. Dr. Harrison Webb entered the room with the eyes of a man who had served the Caruso family for 20 years and had never had to deliver news this bad, holding a whiteboard and writing each word slowly and clearly so Sal could read it. Cochlear trauma on both sides is extremely severe. The auditory nerves are badly damaged. The chance of recovery is extremely low. You need to prepare yourself for the possibility of permanent deafness. Sal finished reading the sentence, looked up at the doctor's face, then down at his right hand that was still intact, the hand that had signed multi-million-dollar contracts, that had grabbed traitors by the collar, that had raised a glass to toast victories amid crowds filled with fear and respect, now lying helpless on a white hospital sheet, trembling beyond his control. He tried to open his mouth to speak, but the sound that came out felt distorted and unfamiliar, like someone else borrowing his mouth, and that sensation made him want to scream, yet he was afraid even the scream would be swallowed by the silence imprisoning him. The following days in the hospital, were a living hell for a man who had built an entire empire on sharp ears and a voice that made people kneel. All communication now had to go through written notes and whiteboards. Emergency meetings with his men turned into slow, suffocating exchanges of scribbled messages. Sal wrote orders without knowing whether his subordinates would follow them correctly because he couldn't hear immediate responses, couldn't read tone, couldn't distinguish truth from lies through handwriting alone. He saw in the eyes of those who once trembled before him something different now, part pity, part calculation. Because in the world Sal ruled, a boss who couldn't hear meant a boss who couldn't control, and a boss who couldn't control was nothing but prey waiting to be torn apart. During the long nights in the hospital room, when Bianca had gone home and the nurses had turned off the lights, Sal lay staring at the stark white ceiling as memories flooded in like a silent torrent. He remembered his father's voice, old Enzo Caruso, rough with cigarette smoke and whiskey, teaching him his first lesson about power when he was 12. He remembered the first gunshot he ever heard at 14, when he watched his father deal with a traitor in a warehouse in Southie. He remembered his mother Rosa's clear laughter, the only woman in the world who dared call Enzo Caruso an idiot, and made him laugh in return, a laughter that went silent when she died of cancer when Sal was 20, and his father never laughed again until the day he too was laid to rest. All those sounds were now only ghosts in Sal's mind. He could hear them in memory but knew he would never hear any real sound again, and that thought pressed on his chest heavier than all 3 broken ribs combined. Franco De Luca came to visit on the 6th day, entering the room with a bouquet of flowers and a face full of concern, writing on the whiteboard, "Rest easy. I'll handle everything outside. No one will dare touch Caruso Holdings while I'm here." Sal read the words and nodded, but he noticed Franco's eyes weren't on him as he wrote. Instead, they swept across the room, lingering on the file folder on the table, on Sal's phone, on Bianca sitting in the corner, and that gaze wasn't worried. It was an inventory, the look of a vulture measuring how long its prey still had to breathe. News of Sal's accident and condition spread through the Boston underworld like wildfire. Rival gangs in Charlestown and East Boston began probing the borders of the territory Sal controlled, testing shipments through routes no one had dared touch before. Some legitimate business partners started delaying payments and avoiding meetings. The empire Sal had built over nearly 20 years was shaking like a building without a foundation. And amid all that chaos, only one man stood unmoved. Paulie Greco, 45 years old. His right arm still bandaged from the night of the accident, standing guard outside Sal's hospital room, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without complaint, without asking for pay, without needing orders. Because Paulie had followed Sal since they were just errand-running kids for old Enzo in the Southie slums, and Paulie's loyalty wasn't something money could buy or fear could shake. It was forged in blood and time. And as long as Paulie stood in front of that door, the outside world needed to understand that Salvatore Caruso might be deaf, might have a broken arm, might lie motionless on a hospital bed, but he wasn't dead yet, and anyone who thought this was the moment to strike should think very carefully again. While Salvatore Caruso lay in a VIP hospital room with Paulie guarding the door and the entire Boston underworld circling outside, less than 15 kilometers to the south, in a studio apartment no bigger than a bathroom in a Beacon Hill mansion, Josephine Reyes jolted awake at 4 o'clock in the morning in the middle of a Boston winter, with the temperature outside dropping below -10 degrees, while the room's heater had been broken for 3 weeks, and the landlord hadn't bothered to fix it, despite her calling 7 times. The studio sat on the 3rd floor of a crumbling building in Dorchester, cracks running from ceiling to floor like veins on an aging hand, peeling paint exposing damp, mold-stained brick beneath, the single window sealed with a sheet of clear plastic, because the glass had shattered in the fall, and Josie couldn't afford to replace it. Tommy slept in an old crib she'd bought secondhand from a Goodwill store for $12. The child curled beneath 2 layers of blankets because the room was too cold, his tiny breaths forming thin white clouds in the air, and Josie stood watching him with her chest tightening as if squeezed by an unseen hand, because she knew a 2-year-old shouldn't be sleeping in cold like this. But she had no other choice. Her hands shook as she opened the refrigerator to take out the last container of formula to prepare for Tommy. Inside there was only half a loaf of white bread, a nearly empty jar of peanut butter, and 2 eggs. Enough for Tommy's breakfast, while Josie would skip eating as she always did, because she always skipped, so her child would have enough. She stood in the narrow kitchen waiting for the milk to warm, and memories came uninvited. She remembered the night she fled Craig Dutton's apartment in Brockton when she was 6 months pregnant with Tommy, her face bruised, lips swollen, belly heavy. Yet she still ran into the street at 2 a.m. under the rain with nothing but a backpack and her identification. A woman driving by saw her crying at a bus stop and took her to Rosie's Place, the oldest shelter for homeless women in the United States, located right in Boston, and Josie lived there for the final 4 months of her pregnancy, gave birth to Tommy in a hospital as a homeless woman on Medicaid, then saved every dollar from night dishwashing shifts and daytime cleaning jobs for a full year to afford the deposit on this battered studio she called home. On the kitchen table lay a stack of mail. Josie was afraid to open but had to read. Bills from the skilled nursing facility where her mother, Carmen Reyes, was staying after severe diabetic complications had cost her right leg up to the knee 8 months earlier. The bill now 2 months overdue, with the latest letter warning that if payment wasn't made within 7 days, they would be forced to transfer her mother to a public facility with far lower quality of care. Beside the bills was a white envelope bearing the logo of a law firm Josie recognized immediately, because this was the 3rd time she'd received it. Inside was a letter from the attorney representing Craig Dutton, stating that their client wished to exercise visitation rights and was considering filing for custody, even though Craig had never once met Tommy since the child was born, even though he'd never sent a single dollar in support, even though he was the man who had punched her 6-month pregnant belly on the night she escaped. Josie set the letter down and looked toward the crib where Tommy was still sleeping, the child shifting and murmuring "Ma" in his dream, and she swallowed her tears, telling herself silently that she just needed to get through today, just needed Tommy to have milk this morning, just needed her mother to have a bed for this week. Everything else could wait. At 7 a.m, Josie left Tommy with her downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Nguyen, a 60-year-old Vietnamese woman living alone, who kindly watched Tommy for free in exchange for Josie helping with grocery runs on weekends. Then Josie took the Orange Line subway to the Four Seasons Hotel where she worked a housekeeping shift from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. Mid-shift, while Josie was scrubbing the bathroom floor of a suite on the 12th floor, the housekeeping manager called her to the office and informed her that the hotel owner's family was urgently hiring a live-in housekeeper to care for a family member who had just suffered a serious accident. The job included cooking, cleaning, and daily assistance, paid 5 times her current wage, with room and board provided at a private mansion, and crucially, permission to bring her small child. Josie asked which family, and when she heard the name Caruso, the blood in her veins seemed to chill for a beat, because anyone who had lived in Boston long enough had heard the rumors about Salvatore Caruso. People said he controlled half the city. People said those who betrayed him vanished without a trace. People said even the police didn't dare knock on his door. Josie was about to refuse, but at that exact moment her phone vibrated with a message from the skilled nursing facility, a final reminder about her mother's overdue bill. And Josie looked at the message, then thought of Tommy sleeping in the freezing room, thought of Craig's lawyer letter, thought of the empty refrigerator, and she understood that the fear of Salvatore Caruso wasn't as terrifying as the fear of being unable to feed her child, so she looked up at the manager and said she'd take the job, asking when she could start. 2 days after accepting the job, Josie stood before the wrought iron gate of the mansion on Beacon Hill on a gray winter morning. Tommy on her left hip, a travel bag torn at the right shoulder hanging from her arm, inside it everything the two of them owned, a few worn clothes, 2 containers of formula, the threadbare teddy bear Tommy never let go of, and a stack of identification papers sealed carefully in a Ziploc plastic bag because they were the most valuable thing Josie possessed. The gate opened, and Josie stepped into a world she had only ever seen on television. The foyer floor paved with white and gray Italian marble, polished so smooth she could see her reflection beneath her feet. A dark oak spiral staircase curving up to the 2nd floor with intricately carved banisters, original paintings on the walls, whose artists Josie did not know, but was certain each was worth more than the studio she had just given up. The scent of oak mingled with leather from the sofas in the living room, creating a fragrance Josie had never smelled before. The smell of money, of power, of a world that did not belong to her. Tommy's round eyes widened as he looked around, his tiny hand pointing up at the crystal chandelier hanging from the center of the ceiling, letting out a long, astonished "oh," and that sound was the only thing that broke the heavy silence of the house, until the click of high heels echoed across the marble from the hallway. Bianca Whitfield appeared in a cream silk dress, blonde hair perfectly waved, makeup immaculate despite it being only 9 in the morning, and she looked Josie up and down with a glance quick but thorough enough to take in everything. The scuffed silver sneakers, the thin coat not warm enough, the black hair pulled into a simple ponytail, the child on her hip wearing a faded onesie, and Josie saw the corner of Bianca's mouth twitch before a polite smile slid into place to cover the disdain. Bianca said welcome in a sweet voice, but her eyes did not smile, then turned to the butler beside her and said quietly but loudly enough for Josie to hear, "Couldn't you find anyone better? She even brought a child in here." Josie heard every word, but her expression did not change. She had been accustomed to being looked down on long before Bianca. Craig had taught her how to swallow humiliation without breaking, so she only held Tommy a little tighter and followed the butler down a long corridor to the room assigned to her in the rear wing of the house, a small room, but clean and warm 100 times over, compared to the studio in Dorchester, with a double bed, a crib for Tommy, and a fireplace that worked properly. And Josie had to bite her lip to keep from crying because for the first time in nearly 3 years, her son would sleep in a warm room. After setting their things down and giving Tommy his milk, the butler led Josie to Sal's study on the first floor for introductions. But before entering, he looked at her with an expression that was half warning and half pity, and murmured that Mr. Caruso was in a very bad mood, and she should prepare herself. Josie nodded, lifted Tommy in her arms, and stepped through the heavy oak door into a dim room with the curtains drawn tight, the faint smell of old whiskey lingering in the air, and she saw a figure sitting motionless in a large leather armchair with his back to the door, face turned toward the closed window, his left arm in a cast resting on the arm of the chair, not turning around even though the door had opened because he could not hear anything. Josie stood there for a few seconds, unsure what to do. Then she stepped forward and gently placed her right hand on Sal's left shoulder, just enough pressure for him to register another person's presence without startling him too violently. But Sal still spun around with the speed of a man who had lived his entire life on alert. Dark eyes sharp as blades locking onto Josie's face with fierce wariness, jaw clenched, body tensed and ready to react, and in that instant Josie understood why all of Boston feared this man, because even sitting helpless in a chair with a broken arm, cracked ribs, and complete deafness, that gaze alone could make anyone step back. But Josie did not step back. She had faced Craig Dutton's fists at 2 a.m. She had given birth alone in a hospital with no one holding her hand. She had slept on a shelter floor for 4 months, so the cold stare of a mafia boss was not enough to make her run. She met his gaze with eyes that held neither fear nor pity, only calm, then reached for the whiteboard and marker on the table beside the chair, and wrote each word clearly and neatly. "I am Josie. I am here to help you. This is Tommy, my son. He can be a little noisy, but he is very well behaved." She held the board up for Sal to read, and at that moment Tommy squirmed in her arms, wanting down. Josie set him on the wooden floor, and the child immediately crawled to the foot of the armchair, plopping down beside Sal's black leather shoes, and beginning to play with his threadbare teddy bear, as if this were his own living room, unafraid, unhesitant, completely at ease in the presence of the man the entire city feared. Sal read the words on the board, then looked down at the child babbling to his teddy bear at the warmth of his palm on her skin, and that frightened her more than anything Craig Dutton had ever done, because Craig had made her fear pain while Sal Caruso was making her fear hope, and Josie knew hope was the most dangerous thing for someone who had grown used to loss. The next morning, when Sal came down to the kitchen and sat in his usual place waiting for breakfast, Josie set the coffee cup in front of him, but didn't sit across from him as she did every day. Instead, standing on the other side of the table, with her hand gripping the chair back, and she spoke in a voice she had practiced all night to keep from trembling, telling him she was grateful for everything he had done, but that she couldn't, that the distance between them was too great, that he controlled half this city while she cleaned his house, that if she stood beside him, Boston high society would laugh at him, and the underworld would see her and Tommy as a weakness to attack him, and she couldn't let her son live in that danger. Sal listened to every word, the coffee steaming in front of him, Tommy babbling on the floor with his teddy bear, and when Josie finished, Sal was silent for a long time before lifting his eyes to her, not the cold gaze he used on Franco, and not the empty look he wore when pretending to be deaf, but the eyes of a man looking at the one thing in his life he was afraid to lose, and he said slowly that he wasn't asking her to love him, he was asking her not to leave. Josie bit her lip and turned away, because she knew if she looked at him for one more second, she wouldn't have the strength to say no. So she only shook her head and carried Tommy out of the kitchen, and all day she avoided Sal, working in silence, leaving notes on the desk instead of handing them to him. And Sal didn't follow or push or ask again, because he understood she wasn't refusing. because she didn't want to stay but because she was afraid. And he'd lived long enough to know that fear, born of too much suffering, couldn't be healed with promises, only with time and actions. But 3 days later, Josie discovered the truth about her mother when she called Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital to check on Carmen and casually asked about the anonymous charity that had paid the costs. And the administrator said she could contact the Ashford Law Office representing the fund for details. And the name Ashford made Josie freeze, because she'd seen it on Caruso Holdings' legal files while organizing papers in Sal's office. Theodore Ashford, Sal's personal lawyer, and everything shattered in her mind like glass struck by a stone. The transfer, the 2 months of overdue bills erased, the private room at the best rehabilitation facility in Boston. All of it Sal. Josie entered Sal's office without knocking for the first time since she'd come to the house. Her eyes red, not from sadness, but from anger. Because Josie Reyes had survived 3 years on her own without taking handouts from anyone, and had been proud of it, even though it nearly killed her. And she stood before Sal breathing hard as she demanded why he hadn't told her, whether he thought he could buy her by paying her mother's hospital bills. Sal watched her standing there shaking with anger, and saw beneath it the fear of becoming indebted, of being bound by gratitude instead of free choice, because Craig had once used money and favors to control her before fists. And Sal understood that to Josie kindness with conditions was more terrifying than open cruelty. He didn't stand or move closer, only sat in his chair and said calmly that he hadn't bought her, that he cared for her mother because she deserved to be cared for, the same way Josie had cared for him when he didn't deserve it, when he'd thrown things and slammed tables and she cleaned without a word, when he pushed everyone away and she still left him notes wishing him good night, that she hadn't done those things for money, and he hadn't done this to want anything from her. He'd done it because it was right, and because he had the means, and she shouldn't have to carry everything alone. Josie stood still for a long time as the anger drained from her face like mist under sunlight, replaced by something she'd hidden for months, and she began to cry, not from anger or sadness, but because for the first time, someone had carried part of her burden without demanding anything in return, because someone had seen her mother not as a financial weight, but as a human being who mattered, and she cried from relief and gratitude, because she'd been strong alone for too long, and tonight she was allowed to be weak without fear of collapsing, because someone was there to hold her up. But the calm barely settled before a new storm arrived, because Franco De Luca didn't leave Boston as ordered, and instead went into hiding and planned revenge. And 5 days after the birthday party, Sal received an unmarked envelope left at the gate. Inside 5 photographs of Tommy playing at Boston Common with Josie, shot from a distance with a telephoto lens. Tommy's face unmistakably clear, and a handwritten note with a single line telling Sal the kid was cute, and to be careful. Polly handed Sal the envelope and stepped back, because he saw something few people ever had and lived to tell. Sal's eyes turning completely black, not the cold fury he'd shown Franco at the party, but a deep burning rage from a place he'd buried long ago. The rage of a man protecting a child he already considered his own, even if he'd never said it aloud. Sal summoned his most loyal men within an hour with orders that allowed no deviation. Josie and Tommy were to be protected around the clock, 2 guards by day and 2 by night. Tommy was not to leave the mansion without at least 2 escorts, and any unfamiliar person approaching within 50 meters of the gate was to be identified immediately. At the same time, Sal called Theo Ashford to the house and handed him the full file Polly had assembled on Franco's illegal dealings, including money laundering through shell companies, federal wire fraud, and ties to 2 rival crews in Charlestown, with one brief instruction to deliver it to the FBI cleanly, with no Caruso trace. Theo passed the file to the Boston FBI office within 24 hours through an intermediary attorney, and 7 days later, Franco De Luca was arrested at a rented apartment in Revere at 5 in the morning by an FBI task force on racketeering and wire fraud charges under RICO, facing a minimum of 20 years in federal prison without early release. And as Franco was cuffed and pushed into the vehicle, Sal stood on the Beacon Hill balcony watching Boston wake under the sunrise, reading Polly's text, nodding once, and pocketing his phone. That afternoon, Sal called Josie into his office, and she entered with worried eyes because she'd seen guards everywhere and knew something had happened she wasn't told. And Sal said calmly, each word heavy as steel, that Franco De Luca had been arrested by the FBI that morning, that he wouldn't walk free for 20 years, that no one would ever touch Tommy, no one in this world, and he swore it. Josie looked at Sal and saw not the promise of a mafia boss flexing power, but the oath of a man who kept her son's crayon drawings in his desk drawer, who'd summoned his personal doctor at 2 in the morning during a blizzard, who'd stood beside her in the dark with his hand on her shoulder as she knelt by her child's bed, crying without sound. And for the first time, Josie didn't step back. She stood there, met his gaze, and nodded. In the weeks after Franco was arrested, and Josie nodded in Sal's office that day, everything in the Beacon Hill mansion slowly found a new rhythm. The ghost of Bianca no longer drifting through the halls with her practiced smile, Franco's calculating gaze no longer sweeping every corner, the house feeling lighter, as if someone had finally thrown open all the windows and let fresh air wash away the heaviness that had lingered for months. Sal and Josie didn't announce anything to anyone. There were no dramatic kisses or ornate declarations. They simply stopped keeping their distance. Josie sat across from Sal at breakfast instead of standing to serve. In the evenings, they sat together on the living room sofa, reading while Tommy played on the floor. And sometimes their hands brushed when they reached for the same cup of tea, and neither pulled away anymore. Then that morning came, an ordinary morning like any other. Spring sunlight pouring through the kitchen windows and laying warm golden squares across the wooden floor. Josie standing at the stove stirring oatmeal for Tommy, Sal at the head of the table with his coffee and the paper, Tommy in his high chair halfway through breakfast when the toddler suddenly wanted down. Josie unlatched the chair and set him on the floor, assuming he'd toddle off to his toys as usual, but instead he turned and ran straight toward Sal, tiny feet pattering across the wood, small arms lifted high, and from those little lips came 2 clear, bright syllables that rang through the sunlit kitchen. Dada, dada. Josie froze by the stove, the wooden spoon slipping from her hand to the floor, her other hand flying to her mouth, because Tommy had never called anyone that in his life. The child was born without a father, grew up without knowing one, had never spoken that word. And now, the first time it left his mouth, it wasn't for Craig Dutton, but for the man sitting at the head of the kitchen table, with his newspaper suspended in midair. Sal looked as Tommy ran toward him, the paper falling to the table, and when the child reached him with arms raised and called Dada again, Sal bent and lifted Tommy with both hands, the boy wrapping his arms tight around Sal's neck, his face pressed into Sal's shoulder. And Salvatore Caruso, the mafia boss who controlled half of Boston, the man the city feared, the man who hadn't cried when he lost his hearing, hadn't cried when he was betrayed, hadn't cried standing before. Nearly 100 people exposing the lies of his fiancée and his lieutenant stood in the middle of the kitchen, holding a 2-year-old child as tears ran down his cheeks, silent, unbroken sobs, just tears flowing as if the final wall he'd built over 37 years had collapsed all at once, and everything it had held back was finally free. Josie rushed forward and wrapped her arms around both of them, one arm across Sal's back and the other around Tommy, her forehead resting against Sal's shoulder from the other side, and the 3 of them stood there in the kitchen holding one another, Tommy in the middle clutching Sal's neck with his small hands, Sal holding Tommy with one arm and pulling Josie close with the other, Josie holding them both as if letting go would make them disappear. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say. Tommy had said it all with those 2 syllables. A 2-year-old who knew nothing of mafia or power or the Caruso empire, who only knew that this man lifted him every afternoon, bought him toys and hid them, summoned a private doctor at 2 in the morning during a blizzard, kept every crooked crayon drawing in his desk drawer. And in the simple, pure logic of a child's world, a man like that could only be one thing: a father. Boston sunlight streamed through the kitchen window over the 3 of them standing there. The same kitchen where months earlier Josie had sat alone crying at midnight over hospital debt letters. The kitchen where Sal had once written, "Sit down and have tea with me," on a scrap of paper, and slid it across the table, now filled with warmth and light. And the sound of Dada still echoed in the air like the most beautiful sound the once completely deaf ears of Salvatore Caruso would ever hear. 6 months after the morning Tommy said Dada in that sun-filled kitchen, on an ordinary evening, when Josie laid Tommy into his crib and went downstairs to make tea out of habit, she noticed a neatly arranged stack of papers on the kitchen table, where she usually left notes for Sal each day. She opened it, and her knees gave out, so she had to grab the edge of the table because it wasn't a business contract or Caruso Holdings paperwork, but official adoption documents. Thomas Miguel Caruso, Tommy's name printed in legal ink carrying the Caruso surname, Sal's signature already at the bottom with a space waiting for Josie's, and clipped beneath the papers was a small, simple diamond ring, not a flashy 5-carat piece like the one Bianca once wore, but a perfectly sized, elegant ring. along with a note written in Sal's familiar handwriting that said, "The adoption papers are the real gift. The ring is just extra, if you say yes." Josie sank to the kitchen floor, clutching the papers to her chest, and sobbed. And when Sal stepped into the kitchen and stood in the doorway watching her, she looked up at him through tear-soaked eyes and nodded, nodding without being able to speak because every word was unnecessary. The wedding took place on a golden autumn day at St. Leonard's Church in Boston's North End, the oldest Italian Catholic church in New England, nestled in the neighborhood where Sal's grandfather emigrated from Sicily nearly a century earlier. And Sal chose it not for grandeur but for roots, because he wanted to stand where Caruso blood first touched American soil to begin the next chapter of his life. The church was simply decorated. White roses lining the aisle, white candles glowing on every pew, autumn sunlight filtering through stained glass and scattering red, blue, and gold across the ancient stone floor. And the guest list was small, because Sal invited only those who truly mattered. In the first pew on the right, Carmen Reyes sat in her wheelchair wearing a light lavender dress Josie had bought for her, her legs amputated to the knees, covered with a flower-embroidered blanket, her face thinner than before, but her eyes bright and tears streaming down her lined cheeks from the moment her daughter walked in, because she had prayed for 3 years asking God to give her daughter happiness, and today that prayer had been answered. Tommy wore a tiny custom-made vest as the ring bearer, but at 2.5 years old he had no idea what a ring bearer was supposed to do. So he ran up and down the aisle between the pews, tripped over Carmen's footrest and almost fell, ran up to the altar and back down again, and the entire church laughed while Josie shook her head smiling. And Sal stood at the altar looking at his son with an expression no one would have believed possible 6 months earlier. Paulie stood beside Sal as best man, his eyes wet, and when someone asked if he was all right, he answered in a hoarse voice that it was autumn pollen allergies, then turned away to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. Even though everyone knew there was no pollen in Boston in October, Regina Palmer and her husband sat in the 3rd row, Dr. Harrison Webb in the 4th, and scattered among them were familiar faces who had witnessed Sal and Josie's journey from that birthday party night to this moment. Josie walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, not a $10,000 designer gown, but one she chose herself from a small shop in Dorchester where she once lived. Her dark hair loose over her shoulders, holding a small bouquet of white roses, with no father to walk her down the aisle. So she walked alone between the rows of candles, and she walked with the steps of a woman who had walked alone for 3 years, and didn't need anyone to guide her. But today was the last time she would walk alone, because after this, she never would be again. When Josie reached the altar, Sal took her hand and they faced one another, and Sal's vows weren't written by a lawyer or wedding planner, but spoken by a man who had lived in silence for months, and now understood the weight of every sound. "Josie, you came when I had nothing left but silence. You stayed when everyone else walked away. You wrote me goodnight notes when the world thought I was finished. Your voice was the first sound that brought me back. I can't promise a perfect life because I'm not a perfect man. But I promise that from today on you'll know you're loved every day. You'll know you're not alone, and our son will grow up knowing that family isn't what you're born into, but what you choose." Josie's vows were shorter because she had to stop twice to catch her breath through tears, but every word came from the deepest place inside her. "Sal, you taught me that strength isn't never falling, but letting someone help you stand back up. You gave Tommy a father I never dared to dream he'd have. You gave me a home when I'd forgotten what having a home felt like. I love you not because you're Salvatore Caruso, but because you're the man who keeps every crooked drawing our son makes in his desk drawer, the man who wrote, 'Sit down and have tea with me' on a piece of paper at 2 a.m. I love you for who you are when it's just the 3 of us in the kitchen, and no one is watching." The small reception was held back at the Beacon Hill mansion, and during it, Sal stood to announce 2 things. First, that he had founded the Miguel Reyes Scholarship Fund for first-generation students, a scholarship named after Josie's late father for first-generation college students from immigrant families. And when Josie heard her father's name, she cried while Carmen clutched her daughter's hand and cried with her. Second, Sal looked at Josie and announced that the Caruso family was expecting a new member, and it took the room a moment to understand before it erupted. Carmen cried harder. Tommy clapped without knowing why, and Paulie didn't even bother pretending allergies this time, and wiped his tears openly, saying he didn't care, making everyone laugh. That night, after the guests had gone and Tommy was asleep, Sal and Josie stood on the second-floor balcony overlooking the lights of Boston below, the same balcony where months earlier Sal had sat alone in the dark listening to Josie sing Tommy to sleep through an open window. unable to name the feeling in his chest. Sal said quietly, "Sometimes I'm grateful for the accident that night." Josie looked at him in surprise, and Sal continued, "Because losing my hearing was the only way I could hear what mattered most." Josie asked, "What was that?" Sal looked out over the city, then back at her. "The sound of you singing to Tommy in Spanish outside my door. The sound of you telling him I deserve to be loved. And the sound of my son calling me Dad." Josie rested her head on Sal's shoulder, and they stood there in the cool Boston night, the city awake and moving beneath Beacon Hill. But on that balcony time stood still for two people who found each other where no one expected. A deaf mafia boss and a housekeeper from Dorchester, who taught each other that real love doesn't arrive like lightning, but through small handwritten notes left on the table each morning, shared cups of tea at 2 a.m, and a tiny hand resting on the cheek of the loneliest man in the city. As for Bianca Whitfield, after Franco was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, she was completely abandoned by him. With no Caruso money and no promises left, she sold her designer items and moved into a modest apartment in Quincy, working retail at a shopping mall, and occasionally at Boston charity events. Sal and Josie saw her from afar without hatred, because they understood that Bianca's betrayal was a disguised gift that led them exactly where they belonged. And if this story teaches us anything, it's that life sometimes has to take away what we value most, so we can see what was truly precious beside us all along. That real strength doesn't live in power or money, but in the courage to open your heart when everything teaches you to close it. That true love doesn't need conditions or perfection, only honesty, and that sometimes the person who changes your life isn't the strongest or the richest, but the gentlest one. The one who writes goodnight notes every evening, the one who sings a lullaby they think no one is listening to. If this story touched your heart, please like and share this video so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories each day. And let us know in the comments how Sal and Josie's story resonated with you. Whether you've ever met someone who arrived when you thought you had nothing left, because we read every comment and listen to every feeling you share from the heart. We wish all of you watching good health, daily peace, and a life filled with the people you love. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next video.